A lot of older Americans have been in the news lately being embarrassed by their younger sex lives. I'm of the age of many of these embarrassed folks, but my story is not nearly ready for prime time. In fact, the tale of my sex life would probably make a very short novel. Nonetheless, here goes. My story begins when I was about 5 years old. An older male from up the street, Bunky Beatty, age 7, met me behind our garage and said, "I'll show you mine if you'll show me yours." And he wasn't talking about Christmas gifts. I figured Bunky was up to no good, so ran into my house. I suppose if Bunky were in the Senate right now, I'd have a case of harassment, and I'd get on CNN. Though if TV adds 10 pounds, I'm not interested. Then there was Curtis. I forgot his last name. Curtis was slightly overweight and nervous, and when I was 14, he asked me to a church dance. I didn't like Curtis much, but he asked, and I accepted, and then I regretted the whole thing. Curtis sweated. When he held my hand dancing, he sweated and my hand got wet. When he put his hand on my back, he left a handprint on my dress. I suppose that date was my case of unwanted touching, and I might have a case here too, unless the judge said my unwanted sweat case was indeed all wet. But I will say this about Curtis: I never forgot him. Many mothers back in the 1940s and 50s didn't teach their daughters much about sex. I learned the mechanics from a girlfriend, Barbara Keck, who somehow knew these things and passed on the rather startling information to her grade school girlfriends. My first reaction to her story was, ew. But my mom did eventually get around to telling me that if a man asked me up to his room alone, I might get into trouble. Why would I get in trouble? Because, Mom said more than once, many men can't control themselves when it comes to sex. She painted such a vivid picture, it was as if every man was Dr. Jekyll who would turn into Mr. Hyde. As a youngster, I didn't learn to cook, balance a checkbook, or change a tire, but I had a vision of terrible consequences if I ever was alone with a man in his room. In high school, I met Bruce, a guy sort of from the wrong side of the tracks, but he was nice and had a car. Bruce and I would talk a lot in the car after we'd come home from movies or parties, and damn if my parents didn't stay up until I got home. I told them not to worry, we just talked, but clearly my parents were just too old and out of date to understand what happened when teenagers had dates in cars. In college, I had a number of boyfriends because in those days at Iowa State College, the ratio of men to women was 3-to-1, and I couldn't help but be popular. I was a sucker for Old Spice cologne on men, and one night an Old Spice wearing date gave me gin to drink. When I got home, I was dizzy and sick as a dog, and ever after I stayed sober. I wasn't much fun at parties. I also dated a future agronomist from Australia, a memorable guy with a great accent, and despite my mother's warnings, this guy was not Mr. Hyde. Though I really liked the Australian, I came close, but the panties stayed on. At work in Chicago, I had a guy pestering me. I talked to the HR department, they talked to him, and the pestering stopped. One time, a married executive made a leap toward me after he'd been drinking. I ducked, and he apologized. My life was not scarred forever because of this incident. I shocked a lot of people during my early work years. I danced with a factory employee at a company party. He was black, handsome, and a great dancer. We both knew everyone was watching, and we loved it. The Kardashians hadn't even been born yet. I was in my late 30s when I first met the man who became my husband. By that time, abortion was legal and gals could get birth control pills even when they weren't married. Times had changed. Paul Friedman appealed to me. He was Jewish, had great hair, and pretty much didn't drink or sweat. He also was funny, was the right age and height, had broad shoulders and lovely hands, and he liked me. One night in my apartment, we were in a romantic mood. He whispered something like, "I'll show you mine if you'll show me yours." I did, and he did, and we lived happily ever after. Sometimes boring sex lives work out just fine. See you next time.